Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The hunting cabin was just as I remembered it. It was tiny, hardly bigger than a tool shed, and after a year of neglect, dust now coated every surface. I hadn't been there in almost 10 years, not since the last time I went hunting with my grandfather Joseph. I'd been so terrified by the thing we saw in the woods there that I hadn't wanted to return, and my parents just assumed I was too bored to want to spend 2 weeks with a boring old man. But Gramps still came to visit us. Thankfully, we never went there. When Gramps passed away a year ago, he left the cabin and the 30 acres surrounding it to his only remaining grandchild. At 28 years old, I had never expected to set foot on the rural mountainside again, much less inherit it. But a bad breakup had left me with the decision of moving into the cabin or into my parents' basement. The choice had almost been hard to make. The local newspaper, the Highland Times, had claimed that Gramps died of a bear attack while out chopping firewood behind his cabin. I didn't really buy that story, though, and even as I pulled my beat-up old Ford into the unpaved driveway, I had my hand on my rifle. Though if that thing came back, I was sure it wouldn't do much to it. But still, it made me feel better. I hadn't seen it in a decade, but if that creature was still out there, I would be prepared this time, at least I hoped. Several hours later, I was unpacked, and the cabin was decently clean. All of the utilities were still hooked up, and the refrigerator was well stocked. I had taken the week off of work to adjust to my new life. I was planning on just relaxing for the next few days. My first night and day passed uneventfully, but by the second night, things were getting a little weird. The isolation was immediate and overwhelming. The cabin sat nestled in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out most of the sunlight during the day and created impenetrable darkness at night. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the small town of Highland Ridge was a good 10-mile drive down winding mountain roads. Cell service was spotty at best, and the ancient landline phone crackled with static whenever I tried to use it. That first evening, I sat on the porch with a beer, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds: crickets chirping, owls hooting, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Normal sounds, expected sounds. But as the night deepened, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I told myself it was nothing. Just my imagination playing tricks on me, fueled by childhood memories and the knowledge of how my grandfather had died. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to sleep. I had spent enough time in the country as a child to be familiar with the wildlife here. Raccoons, skunks, bears, other mammals. But the freshly made claw marks on the side of the cabin, they weren't anything that I recognized. I woke up on my third morning to gouges in the wood, and I was definitely unnerved. They were too large to belong to any small critters, and far too high up to be from coyotes. They were even too wide to be a mountain lion or bear. In this neck of the woods, that ruled out everything logical. As I studied the claw marks, I wondered how I could have slept through them being made. They definitely hadn't been there when I first arrived, and the fresh marks stood out in a bright contrast to the weathered wood of the cabin walls. I supposed a human could have made them with a knife, but I didn't have neighbors for miles. Who would be skulking around out here just to prank me like this? It didn't make any sense. It crossed my mind that maybe my ex might have done it, just to freak me out. But Veronica lived almost 50 miles away and did not have the address for the cabin in the first place. I don't use social media enough to bother listing my new address, and we didn't have friends in common or anything like that. I eventually shrugged it off, deciding to let it go. I knew that worrying about it wouldn't help. That afternoon, though, I found myself driving the 10 miles into town and buying some motion-activated floodlights and a motion-sensing camera. 2 more nights passed, and each morning, I woke up to the claw marks getting closer and closer to the cabin door. As much as I wanted to believe it was a prank, I had to admit to myself that the evidence was overwhelmingly against that idea. The floodlights would turn on and the camera would snap. Yet somehow, all I would ever see in the photos was an empty yard. I had even tried to set up a video on my phone, but all it managed to capture was a vague blur of movement at the edge of the screen. The blur was elongated, taller than a person should be, with what looked like unnaturally long limbs. The image made my stomach twist into knots. The marks continued to appear, now accompanied by other disturbances. One morning I found the garden soil disturbed, as if something had been digging. Another day, I discovered a pile of small animal bones arranged in a bizarre pattern near the woodpile. Each night, whatever was out there seemed to be growing bolder, coming closer to the cabin, leaving more evidence of its presence. I began to notice other things too. Sometimes the cabin creaked and groaned at night, but not in the way old structures typically do. These sounds were rhythmic, almost deliberate. When I went to investigate, I found nothing, but the air felt different, heavier, charged with a presence I couldn't see but could definitely feel. On the fifth night, the temperature dropped unexpectedly. A strange fog rolled in from the woods, creeping across the clearing like ghostly fingers reaching for the cabin. I sat by the window, watching it swirl and dance in the moonlight, forming shapes that seemed almost human before dissolving back into mist. That was when I first heard the whispering. I had enough. On the fifth night, I went outside, rifle in hand, settling comfortably on the porch steps. There was no noise, no sound to indicate that the usual nocturnal critters were up and about. I shut all the lights off and waited for the creature that I knew would come. The fog had thickened, wrapping around the trees like a shroud. The forest beyond the clearing was a wall of impenetrable darkness. The moon, nearly full, cast an eerie glow that made the fog luminescent. I checked my rifle for the 10th time, making sure it was loaded and ready. Hours passed, and as 1 a.m. rolled around, I snapped myself out of a doze. The whispering had returned, faint but unmistakable. Words I couldn't quite make out, spoken in a voice that sounded disturbingly familiar. I strained to hear, to understand, but the words remained just beyond comprehension. Then I could hear something moving quietly out by the edge of the woods, where I could make out a figure skulking about, its features hidden in the shadows. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was certain whatever was out there could hear it. My mouth went dry and my palms grew slick with sweat, making it difficult to maintain my grip on the rifle. The figure moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes dropping to all 4s. It circled the clearing, staying just at the edge of visibility. I raised the rifle, trying to get it in my sights, but it moved too erratically, too quickly. As the animal drew closer, I rubbed my eyes in disbelief because there stood Joseph, my supposedly dead grandpa. He wasn't wearing any clothes. He paused mid-step, his head slowly turning to face me, probably hearing me gasp from shock. Grandpa looked sickly, with skin pale and ribs visible. He was bald now, his once robust beard and hair gone. "Grandpa," I called out. I could hear the quiver in my own voice, and my hands were shaking from terror. The rifle had fallen to my lap, nearly forgotten in the intensity of seeing my presumably dead grandfather. I'd been so convinced that what I was about to see would be that antlered creature that I saw years ago, the one I knew killed Joseph. But I never considered once that my grandpa was still alive. "Grandpa, what are you doing? Come inside." Tears were streaming down my cheeks. I didn't care what my grandfather had been doing this whole time or why he was out there. All I cared about was that he was still alive. I wanted to hug him again. "You stupid boy. It's too late." His voice barely sounded human anymore. His voice came out all wrong, like someone trying to remember how to speak after years of silence. The words were formed correctly, but the cadence, the tone, everything was off. And before I could respond, Grandpa was bounding into the woods on all fours. He was gone in the blink of an eye, the bushes hardly swaying where he had passed through. The woods remained as eerily silent as they had been before, even though my grandfather's retreat should have made a large amount of noise. Not a second later, a low growl came from behind me, the sound reverberating off the cabin walls. A massive creature, the one that I remembered, approached from the side of the cabin. Within seconds, it became clear to me that it wasn't a human or an animal, unless someone was wearing an amazing and terrifying costume. The creature was every bit as surreal as I remembered. Long, pale limbs sprouted from an emaciated torso. An ivory deer skull shined in what little moonlight managed to bleed out through the clouds. It was wearing ragged old buckskin leggings and had beads around its neck. I could not see its eyes, though, but I knew without a doubt that if it had any, it was staring directly at me. I knew not whether it was a creature from native folklore or something else, but it didn't matter. It was here. Before I could take in any more detail, the creature began to laugh, a guttural sound that echoed in my head hauntingly. It was laughing so hard at me that it nearly doubled over. I realized that its limbs were able to wrap around its body almost twice. I raised my rifle, firing several times at it point blank, all of those rounds lodging firmly into the creature's neck and torso. The being looked down at its new piercings. Then, without a problem, almost comfortably, it began to dig out the bullets at an unhurried pace. It dropped them onto the ground like a child plucking flower petals, and it seemed to sigh in irritation as it dug out the final one. "Do you think your grandfather tried the same thing?" The voice that emerged from beneath the skull was deep and resonant, with an accent I couldn't place, ancient and yet modern at the same time. He did, many times, until he realized there were better ways to survive. It just spoke. What was going on? What did this thing want? Did Grandpa always know about this horrendous-looking thing? My head began to ache with the strain of trying to understand all this. It seemed as though it was annoyed by the bullets. It then lifted its claw and pointed it at the cabin. "You don't belong here. This place has been claimed. Leave while you still have the option. Go," was all I could get out in reply to this thing speaking to me. I blinked profusely, and the next thing I knew, the monster was gone, and standing there was Bennett, my Grandpa Joseph's best friend. Bennett had been around as long as I could remember, and had always been a kind old man. He supposedly lived on the other side of the mountain. Even though I'd never actually seen his house, let alone been to it, Bennett just always sort of appeared out of nowhere, often startling us so badly that we had almost shot him a few times. "What in tarnation you doing out here, whippersnapper?" "Am I dreaming?" I managed to stammer, still gripping the rifle, though I'd lowered it. "No, you're not dreaming, but you need to get inside before that thing comes back. That thing that looks like your granddaddy." I was shaking so tremendously from fear that I could barely move my limbs at the time, but I managed to navigate the steps. I'm not entirely sure why I obeyed Bennett after seeing that thing, but after seeing Bennett's familiar face, there was something calming about it, making this insane situation more easily dealt with. Once inside, Bennett bolted the door and drew all the curtains. He moved with a familiarity that suggested he'd been in the cabin many times before. Without asking, he went to a specific floorboard near the fireplace, pried it up, and pulled out a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. "Your granddaddy and I kept this for emergencies," he said, pouring generous amounts into both glasses. His hands were steady, but I noticed deep scars across his knuckles and forearms. "Drink. You need it." I downed the bourbon in one gulp, welcoming the burning sensation. What was that thing? And why did it look like my grandfather? Bennett sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 70-something years. "That wasn't your grandfather. That thing. It takes forms that will affect you the most, makes you hesitate, makes you vulnerable. But what is it? Some folks around these parts have names for it. Old names. But names don't matter much when you're face to face with it. Bennett refilled my glass. What matters is that it's been here a long time. Long before your grandfather bought this land. Long before anyone settled here. You've seen it before. Many times. Bennett rolled up his sleeve to reveal a twisted scar that ran from wrist to elbow. Got this the first time back in '82. Your grandfather saved my life that night. Is that why he always had a shotgun by the door? Even when we were just fishing? Bennett nodded. Joseph never took chances after our first encounter. He knew what was out there. But the newspaper said he was killed by a bear. A bitter laugh escaped Bennett's lips. That's what the authorities put down. Easier that way. No one wants to admit there's something in these woods that can't be explained, can't be hunted, can't be stopped. I felt a cold dread settling in my stomach. If bullets don't work, how do you fight it? You don't. Bennett's eyes met mine, and I saw genuine fear there. You survive. You learn its patterns. You make accommodations. Accommodations? What does that mean? Bennett looked away. Your grandfather made a deal. That's why he was able to live here as long as he did. What kind of deal? But Bennett shook his head. That's not for me to say. Joseph took that to his grave. But I do know this. That thing out there, it's coming back. And it wants something from you now. I couldn't sleep that night. Bennett took the couch, his snores filling the cabin with a comforting human sound. I sat by the window, watching the woods, jumping at every shadow and sound. By morning, I was exhausted, but determined to understand what was happening. Over a breakfast of strong coffee and bacon, Bennett told me what he knew about the history of the area. The land had belonged to a logging company in the 1950s, but operations had ceased after a series of unexplained accidents. Several workers had disappeared, others had suffered from delusions and violent outbursts. The company had eventually abandoned the site, selling off parcels to private buyers at ridiculously low prices. Your grandfather got this place for a song, Bennett said. He knew the stories, but he didn't believe them. Not at first. When did he start believing? The summer of '79. That's when he first saw it. He was clearing land for the cabin, and it came to him at dusk. Stood right where he was working and stared at him. He ran all the way to my place that night, white as a sheet, talking nonsense about a man with a deer's head. Bennett explained that over the years they had researched similar sightings in the area, going back to the earliest settlers. Even the native tribes had stories about the mountain and warned against settling here. They spoke of a being that guarded the land, that demanded respect and tribute. Your grandfather became obsessed with understanding it, Bennett continued. He collected every story, every account, spent years tracking its appearances, its behavior. And what did he learn? That it follows rules, has patterns. It's not random, not completely. There's a logic to it, even if it's not human logic. I thought about the claw marks, getting closer to the cabin each night. The animal bones arranged in patterns. The whispering that seemed to be trying to communicate something. You said my grandfather made a deal. What kind of deal could anyone make with something like that? Bennett's expression darkened. I don't know the specifics. Joseph stopped telling me everything after a while, but I know it involved sacrifices. Sacrifices? Like animals? At first. Bennett wouldn't meet my eyes. But things escalated over the years. Your grandfather changed, became secretive, started spending more and more time alone in the woods. A terrible thought occurred to me. Is that why he stopped inviting me up here? After that summer when I was 18. Bennett nodded slowly. He was protecting you. He told me once that he saw how that thing looked at you. Like it was interested. I remembered the last hunting trip with my grandfather. How jumpy he'd been. How he'd insisted I stay inside after dark. The argument we'd had when I'd wanted to go night fishing at the lake. And then, the night before we were supposed to leave, I'd seen something watching us from the tree line, something tall and thin with antlers silhouetted against the moon. Grandfather had hustled me into the truck the next morning, barely giving me time to pack. We'd never spoken of it, and he'd never invited me back. "What happens now?" I asked. "You have two choices," Bennett said. "Leave and never come back. Sell the land to someone who doesn't know any better. Or what? Or you learn to live with it. Make your own arrangement." That night, Bennett left. He claimed he needed to get back to his own place before dark, but I suspected he didn't want to be at the cabin when night fell. Before he left, he pressed something into my hand. A small leather pouch filled with herbs and what looked like small bones. "Keep this with you," he said. "It won't stop it, but it might buy you some time if things go bad." Alone in the cabin, I considered my options. Leaving seemed the obvious choice. I could go back to the city, find a new apartment, a new job, start fresh. But something kept me rooted there. A combination of stubbornness, curiosity, and a strange sense that running wouldn't solve anything. That thing had been interested in me for a decade. Who was to say it wouldn't follow? As night fell, I prepared myself. I placed Bennett's pouch around my neck. I positioned myself in the center of the main room, away from windows and doors. And I waited. The scratching started just after midnight. Gentle at first, almost tentative, at the back door. Then more insistent, moving to the windows, the walls, the roof. The whole cabin seemed to vibrate with the creature's presence. The temperature dropped dramatically, my breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air. And then the whispering started again, but this time I could understand the words. "Grandson of Joseph, inheritor of debts. We have business, you and I." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, inside my head and all around me. I clutched Bennett's pouch, trying to steady my breathing. "What do you want?" I managed to say, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. "The same thing I wanted from your grandfather. The same thing I've always wanted." "And what's that?" A low, rumbling laugh that made the floorboards vibrate. "Acknowledgement, respect, tribute." "What kind of tribute?" The scratching stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I could hear my heart pounding. "Come outside and we'll discuss terms." Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to keep the barriers between myself and that thing intact. But I knew, somehow, that this moment had been inevitable since I first inherited the cabin. Perhaps even before that. Perhaps since that night 10 years ago, when it had first seen me. I moved to the door, my hand hovering over the knob. "If I come out, we talk. Nothing more. Do you agree?" Another laugh, softer this time. "I agree to hear you. That is all I can promise." Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. It was waiting for me, standing at the bottom of the steps. In the moonlight, it looked both more and less human than before. The deer skull seemed to float above the emaciated body, antlers reaching toward the stars like gnarled fingers. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in impossible directions. "Joseph's blood," it said, the skull not moving but the voice clear in the night air. "You have his stubbornness, his curiosity, his fear." "What was your deal with my grandfather?" "Protection. For a price." "What price?" The creature tilted its head, an unnervingly human gesture on such an inhuman form. "Animals, at first. then secrets, then stories. Your grandfather was a wonderful storyteller. He would sit right where you're standing now and tell me tales of the world beyond these woods, of history and wars and human follies. In exchange, I kept other dangers away from his home. Other dangers? Like what? These woods harbor many threats. Bears, mountain lions, men with darker intentions than mine. Your grandfather understood the value of my protection. I considered this. And when did the arrangement change? Bennett said things, escalated. The creature's posture shifted, becoming more rigid. Your grandfather grew old, forgetful. He began to forget our arrangement, to wander into parts of the woods that were forbidden to him, to challenge boundaries we had established. So you killed him. I claimed what was owed to me, it corrected, voice hardening. As is my right. Fear gave way to anger, hot and sharp in my chest. He was my grandfather. He was a trespasser who violated our covenant. The creature took a step closer. But you are not bound by his mistakes. We can establish new terms, more favorable ones perhaps. What would you want from me? Company, it said simply. These woods are vast and empty. Eternity stretches long without conversation. That's all? Just talking to you? For now. Needs change with time. But yes, for now. Your presence, your stories, your acknowledgement that this land is as much mine as it is yours. I thought about Bennett's warnings, about my grandfather's fate, about the claw marks getting closer to the door each night. And if I refuse? The creature's form seemed to blur at the edges, stretching taller, its antlers scraping the lowest branches of the nearby pines. Then you will find these woods most unwelcoming, and the barriers of your cabin most insufficient. I needed to make myself think through this logically, despite the fear making my thoughts scatter like leaves in a windstorm. The creature wanted company, stories, recognition. Was that really so terrible a price for safety, for the chance to stay in my new home? But I remembered Bennett's scars, my grandfather's fate, the creature's admission that needs change with time. Any deal I made now might evolve into something darker, more demanding. Yet running seemed equally futile. This thing had fixated on me years ago, had perhaps been waiting for me to return, and it clearly had powers beyond my understanding. What was to stop it from following me if I fled? If I agree, I said slowly, there would be rules, boundaries, for both of us. The creature was motionless, but I sensed its attention sharpening. Speak your terms. You never enter the cabin without invitation. You never harm me or anyone who visits me. You protect the property from other threats, as you did for my grandfather. Acceptable. And in return? I took a deep breath. I'll talk with you. Share stories, news from beyond these woods. Acknowledge your connection to this land. Not enough, it said, voice rumbling like distant thunder. I require more tangible recognition. Like what? Offerings. Left at the edge of the woods each new moon. Nothing living, it added, seeing my expression. Food, trinkets, objects of interest from the world of men. It seemed a small price to pay for safety, for survival. Agreed. Then we have a covenant. The creature extended one long, clawed hand, sealed with a touch, as is tradition. Every fiber of my being revolted at the idea of touching that thing, but I forced myself forward, down the steps, until I stood before it. Slowly, I extended my hand. Its touch was not what I expected. Not cold or scaly or rough, but warm and dry, like sun-baked stone. The moment our hands met, a jolt of something like electricity ran up my arm, and images flashed through my mind. The forest as it had been centuries ago, millennia ago, the rise and fall of civilizations, the creature standing unchanged through it all, watching, waiting. And then it was over. The creature released my hand and stepped back. "The covenant is made," it said. "Sleep without fear tonight, grandson of Joseph. We will speak again soon." It turned and moved toward the tree line, its form seeming to elongate and thin as it went, until it was indistinguishable from the shadows between the trees. I returned to the cabin, locked the door out of habit rather than necessity, and collapsed onto the couch. My hand still tingled where it had touched me, and my mind buzzed with the echoes of those ancient visions. I needed to make some decisions about this place, about how I would honor this strange arrangement while protecting myself from its potential evolution, about what I would tell Bennett, or anyone else who asked why I chose to stay in a place with such a dark history. But those were concerns for tomorrow. Tonight, for the first time since arriving at the cabin, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, undisturbed by scratching or whispering or the weight of watching eyes. In the morning, I found a small, intricately carved wooden figure on the porch steps. A man with a deer's head, arms outstretched in what might have been a gesture of welcome or warning. A reminder of our covenant. I placed it on the mantel, where my grandfather had kept his most treasured possessions, where it would be visible to anyone who visited. A conversation piece, perhaps. A way to share the story of the cabin and its guardian without revealing too much. After all, who would believe me if I told the whole truth? Some stories are better left as mysteries, shared only with those who already understand the strangeness that lurks at the edges of our world. But sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the forest is too quiet, I wonder if I made the right choice. If the price of staying will eventually grow too steep. If my grandfather tried to warn me in his way by keeping me away from this place after that long ago summer. And sometimes, when I sit on the porch telling stories to the darkness, I imagine I see my grandfather's face behind that ivory skull, listening, waiting, judging my choices against his own. "3 years have passed since that nightmare, but I still wake up in cold sweats, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I was 13 then, just a skinny kid who thought the worst thing that could happen in the woods was getting lost or maybe encountering a bear. How wrong I was. It was late October 2022 when Grandpa Eugene and I made our way up the winding dirt road to his hunting cabin. The autumn air bit at my cheeks through the open truck window, carrying the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and something else. Something that made my stomach clench without understanding why. The trees pressed in on both sides of the narrow path, their bare branches reaching across like skeletal fingers trying to snare our vehicle. Grandpa Eugene had been taking me to this remote cabin since I was 8 years old. It sat nestled in a valley about 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a treacherous dirt road that wound through dense forest for nearly 6 miles. No cell phone service, no electricity except for a small generator, and no neighbors for miles in any direction. Just us, the wilderness, and whatever lurked in those shadowy depths between the trees. The cabin itself was a modest 2-story structure built from rough-hewn logs, weathered gray by decades of harsh mountain winters. A wide front porch wrapped around 2 sides, its floorboards creaking ominously under even the lightest footstep. The windows were small and deep-set, giving the place an almost squinting appearance, as if it were perpetually suspicious of its surroundings. As we unloaded our supplies, I noticed how the silence seemed different this time. Usually the forest buzzed with the subtle sounds of wildlife. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, the distant rustle of deer moving through underbrush. But now, as evening shadows began to stretch across the clearing, everything felt muted, oppressive. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir the branches above our heads. "Storm coming in tomorrow night," Grandpa Eugene said, hefting a cooler full of food up the porch steps. His weathered face was creased with concentration, but I caught something else in his expression, a flicker of unease that he tried to hide behind his usual gruff demeanor. Might be our last trip up here before winter sets in proper. I helped carry our gear inside, the familiar smell of wood smoke and old leather greeting us. The cabin's interior was cramped but cozy, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a narrow staircase leading to the loft where Grandpa Eugene slept. I always took the old couch downstairs, partly because I liked being close to the warmth of the dying embers, but mostly because my chronic insomnia made it easier to get up and move around without disturbing anyone. That first night passed without incident, though I found myself lying awake longer than usual, listening to the subtle sounds of the cabin settling around us. Old wood creaked and groaned as temperatures dropped, and somewhere in the walls, mice scurried through hidden passages. But it was the spaces between these familiar sounds that bothered me, moments of absolute silence that felt too heavy, too deliberate. Around 3 a.m, I finally drifted off to an uneasy sleep, my dreams filled with vague impressions of movement in the darkness beyond the windows, as if something was circling the cabin just beyond the reach of moonlight. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive, with low clouds hanging like a burial shroud over the surrounding peaks. I woke with a headache and the lingering taste of fear in my mouth, though I couldn't remember why. Grandpa Eugene was already up, stoking the fire and preparing coffee in his battered metal pot. "Sleep all right?" he asked, not looking up from his task. "Fine," I lied, rubbing the grit from my eyes. The truth was, I felt like I'd been running all night, my muscles tense and my nerves frayed. After a breakfast of eggs and bacon cooked over the open fire, Grandpa Eugene announced that we needed fresh water from the old well. The cabin's pump had given out 2 summers ago, and he'd never bothered to fix it, preferring to haul water from the hand-dug well about a quarter-mile through the trees. "Take the big jug," he said, pointing to a 5-gallon container by the door. "And don't dawdle. Weather's turning, and I want to get some firewood split before it starts coming down." The path to the well was little more than a deer trail, winding through thick stands of pine and oak. Fallen leaves carpeted the ground in shades of rust and amber, muffling my footsteps but creating the illusion that every small sound was magnified in the heavy air. Broken branches littered the way, some freshly snapped, their exposed wood pale as bone. The well itself sat in a small clearing, its stone walls rising about 3 feet above ground level. A rusty hand pump stood guard beside it, requiring significant effort to bring up the sweet cold water from 60 feet below. As I worked the pump handle, my shoulders burning with the effort, I became gradually aware of a feeling that made my scalp tingle with unease. I was being watched. The sensation started as nothing more than a vague discomfort, like an itch I couldn't locate. But as I continued pumping, filling the heavy jug drop by precious drop, the feeling intensified until it became an almost physical presence pressing against my back. My hands began to shake, making it difficult to maintain my grip on the pump handle. I forced myself to continue with my task, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild in the isolated setting. But when the jug was finally full and I could no longer ignore the crawling sensation between my shoulder blades, I straightened up and slowly turned around. There, on the hillside about 50 yards away, stood a figure. At that distance, details were impossible to make out clearly, but the silhouette was unmistakably human. Tall, lean, and absolutely motionless. What struck me most forcibly was the clothing, where every hunter or hiker I'd ever encountered in these woods wore bright orange safety gear or earth-toned camouflage. This figure was dressed entirely in black. The dark clothing made him nearly invisible against the shadowed trees, a living void in the autumn landscape. For several long seconds we regarded each other across the clearing. I felt my heart rate accelerate, pumping blood through my ears with such force that it drowned out all other sound. My mouth went dry, and I had to resist the urge to drop the heavy water jug and run. Then, without warning, the figure began to move. He didn't walk down the hill toward me, which somehow would have been less terrifying. Instead, he began a slow, deliberate traverse along the hillside, maintaining his elevation but gradually working his way around the perimeter of the clearing. His movements were fluid, predatory, like a wolf circling its prey. I grabbed the water jug with both hands, the weight of it making my arms shake with more than just exertion. Without taking my eyes off the figure, I began backing toward the trail that would lead me home. The stranger continued his circuit, always staying the same distance away, always keeping me in sight. When I reached the trailhead, I turned and hurried back toward the cabin as fast as the heavy jug would allow. Behind me, I heard no pursuit, no breaking branches or rustling leaves. But that absence of sound was somehow worse than any noise would have been. It meant he was good at moving quietly through the forest, skilled in ways that made my amateur stumbling seem pitiful by comparison. By the time I reached the cabin, my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool air. Grandpa Eugene looked up from the pile of firewood he'd been splitting, taking in my flushed face and shaking hands. "What's got into you, boy? Look like you've seen a ghost." "There's someone out there," I gasped, setting the water jug down with a heavy thud. By the well, a man in black clothes just standing there watching me. Grandpa Eugene drove the axe head deep into the chopping block and straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. His gray eyes, usually warm with humor, sharpened as he studied my face. "Probably just another hunter passing through," he said, but I caught the slight tension in his voice. "Lots of folks use these old trails, even if they're not supposed to. Nothing to worry about." "But he wasn't hunting," I insisted. "He didn't have a gun, and he was wearing all black. Who hunts in black clothes?" And he was just watching me, following me around the clearing. Grandpa Eugene's weathered hands absently adjusted his grip on the axe handle. "These woods make sounds carry funny sometimes. Makes your imagination run wild, too. Been happening to hunters for generations." Despite his reassuring words, he spent the rest of the morning staying close to the cabin, abandoning his plan to scout for deer sign or check his old hunting spots. Instead, he busied himself with maintenance tasks, cleaning his rifle, checking the action on his shotgun, inventorying our food supplies with unusual care. As afternoon stretched toward evening, I found myself constantly drawn to the windows, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The stranger's image was burned into my memory. That tall, motionless silhouette against the dark trees. The sense of malevolent intelligence behind his observation. Every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. Every swaying branch could be concealing a human form. "I need to get more water for cooking," Grandpa Eugene announced as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. "Well's the only source we've got." "I'll come with you," I said quickly. He shook his head. "Two people make too much noise. Besides, I want you to stay here and keep an eye on things." "What things?" The question came out sharper than I intended. "Just things," he replied, checking the load in his pistol before sliding it into the holster on his belt. "Probably nothing, but better safe than sorry." I watched through the front window as he disappeared into the trees, my anxiety building with each minute that passed. The forest seemed to swallow him completely, offering no glimpse of his progress or any sign that he was still moving safely through the undergrowth. Time crawled by with excruciating slowness, marked only by the gradual deepening of shadows across the clearing. When he finally returned, carrying a full water container, his face was grim. "Find anything?" I asked. "Boot prints around the well," he said simply. "Fresh ones. Size 11 or 12. Deep tread like hiking boots. Been there since this morning, maybe earlier." The revelation sent ice through my veins. So he was really there, He was really there, Grandpa Eugene confirmed. Question is, what's he doing way out here? Nearest trail is 5 miles east and there's no hunting lease on this land. No reason for anyone to be wandering around unless... He didn't finish the sentence, but I could fill in the blank. Unless he was here for a reason that had nothing to do with hunting or hiking. Unless he was here because of us. As darkness began to fall, Grandpa Eugene made a thorough check of the cabin's security. He tested the locks on both doors, made sure all windows were securely latched, and positioned his rifle within easy reach of his sleeping area upstairs. The normalcy of our evening routine, cooking dinner over the fire, playing cards by lamplight, preparing for bed, felt forced, brittle, as if we were both trying too hard to pretend everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. Even Grandpa Eugene, with his decades of wilderness experience and natural skepticism, had been disturbed by what he'd found at the well. His usual easy confidence was replaced by a watchful tension that made my own anxiety spike higher. Around 9 o'clock, he announced he was going to bed early. "You should try to get some sleep too," he suggested, though we both knew my insomnia made that unlikely. Long day tomorrow, and we need to be sharp. I settled onto the couch with a book, but the words blurred together meaninglessly. Every small sound from outside, a branch scraping against the roof, an owl calling in the distance, the whisper of wind through pine needles, made me jolt with nervous energy. The darkness beyond the windows was absolute, impenetrable, hiding whatever might be moving through it. At some point during the long, sleepless hours that followed, I began to understand that this was exactly what our watcher wanted. Not necessarily to harm us, at least not yet, but to rob us of peace, to make us jump at shadows, to transform our refuge into a prison of fear. And it was working. By midnight, my nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Every muscle in my body ached from constant tension, and my eyes burned from staring into the darkness beyond the cabin windows. I'd given up any pretense of reading and was lying on the couch, clutching my phone like a lifeline, even though it had no signal this deep in the mountains. The silence outside was complete and unnatural. No nightbirds called, no small animals rustled through the underbrush, no insects hummed their usual nocturnal chorus. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on the familiar sounds of the cabin, the whisper of cooling wood, the soft settling of old timbers, the distant sound of Grandpa Eugene's breathing from the loft above. These gentle noises should have been comforting, but instead they only served to highlight the oppressive quiet that pressed against the walls like a living thing. That's when I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the front door. My eyes snapped open, my heart instantly hammering so hard I was sure it would wake Grandpa Eugene. I lay frozen on the couch, every nerve ending screaming at me to run, to hide, to do anything except remain motionless in the darkness. The knocking came again. Louder this time, more insistent. Each blow against the solid wood door seemed to reverberate through my chest, shaking something loose inside me that I'd never even known was there. This wasn't the quick, friendly rap of a lost hiker seeking help. This was patient, methodical. The sound of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had all the time in the world to do it. I pressed my face into the couch cushions, squeezing my eyes shut and praying that whoever was out there would simply go away. But even through the fabric, I could hear my own ragged breathing, could feel the violent trembling that had taken over my entire body. The third series of knocks was different, harder, more aggressive. The door shook in its frame, and I heard the metal hinges creak under the assault. Whoever was out there was no longer content to simply announce their presence. They wanted in. Terror finally overcame paralysis. I rolled off the couch and crawled across the rough wooden floor, my knees scraping against splinters and nail heads. At the base of the stairs, I hauled myself upright and took the steps 3 at a time, no longer caring about the noise I was making. "Grandpa Eugene," I whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. "Grandpa, wake up." He came awake instantly, the reflexes of a lifetime outdoorsman kicking in. His hand went immediately to the pistol on his nightstand as his eyes focused on my terrified face. "What is it?" "Someone's knocking on the door," I gasped. "They've been doing it for the last few minutes. It's not normal knocking. It's like they're trying to..." From below came another series of blows, harder than before. The entire cabin seemed to shake, and I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of the front door handle being tested, turned slowly one way and then the other. Grandpa Eugene was out of bed in one fluid motion, pulling on his boots and grabbing both his pistol and the heavy flashlight from beside his bed. His face was grim but focused, all traces of sleep banished by the threat outside our walls. "Stay up here," he commanded in a voice that brooked no argument. "Get in that corner, behind the dresser, and don't make a sound. If something happens to me, there's a window in the back wall. You climb out onto the roof and run for the truck. Keys are in my jeans pocket." "I don't want you to go down there," I whispered, but he was already moving toward the stairs. "Lock this door behind me," he said. "Don't open it for anyone except me, and don't open it unless you hear my voice saying your real name. If someone else tries to get you to open it, even if they sound like me, you keep it locked. Understand?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I understood anything anymore. The rational world I'd known just hours earlier was crumbling around me, replaced by something dark and primitive where strangers knocked on doors in the middle of the night and grandfathers crept through their own homes with loaded guns. From downstairs came a new sound, not knocking, but scratching. Long, deliberate scrapes against the door, as if someone was dragging their fingernails along the wood. The sound raised goosebumps along my arms and made my teeth ache with sympathetic vibration. Grandpa Eugene paused at the top of the stairs, his weathered face set in hard lines. "Remember what I told you?" he said. Then he was gone, moving down the steps with surprising stealth for a man his age. I pressed my ear to the closed door, trying to track his movements below. I heard the soft whisper of his bare feet on wood, the faint creak of a floorboard near the front windows. Then nothing. The scratching stopped. For several long minutes, the silence was absolute. No sound from inside the cabin, no noise from the forest beyond. Even my own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the suffocating quiet. Then came a sound that nearly stopped my heart. The distinctive crack of Grandpa Eugene's pistol, shockingly loud in the confined space of the cabin. "Boy!" his voice boomed from below. "Get down here now. We're leaving." I fumbled with the door lock, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp the simple mechanism. When it finally clicked open, I stumbled onto the landing and practically fell down the steep stairs in my haste to reach Grandpa Eugene. He was standing near the front windows, his pistol still in his hand, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness beyond the glass. His face was pale but determined, and I could see a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool night air. "What happened?" I gasped. "What did you shoot at?" "Saw him at the window," Grandpa Eugene said grimly. Face pressed right up against the glass, staring in. When I turned on the light, he didn't even flinch. Just kept looking at us like we were fish in a bowl. The image sent fresh waves of terror coursing through me. The idea of that dark figure standing just feet away, separated from us by nothing but a thin pane of glass, made my stomach lurch with nausea. "Did you hit him?" "Don't know. He dropped down below the window frame when I fired, but I can't tell if it was from being hit or just taking cover." He moved to the front door, checking the heavy bolt lock. "But I'll tell you what, I put a round right through that window. If he was smart, he's running for the next county by now." Despite his confident words, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept darting to the darkened windows, as if expecting that pale face to reappear at any moment. "We can't stay here," I said, voicing what we both knew. "He knows we're in here and he's not going away." Grandpa Eugene nodded. "Get your shoes and jacket. We're getting in the truck and driving straight to town. No stops, no looking back." I ran to where I'd left my boots by the door, pulling them on with fingers that felt thick and clumsy. My jacket was hanging on a peg near the fireplace, and as I reached for it, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood freeze. There, clearly visible in the soft ash that had spilled from the fireplace, was a boot print. Not one of ours. This print was larger, deeper, with a distinctive tread pattern that spoke of expensive hiking boots. Someone had been inside the cabin. "Grandpa," I whispered, pointing at the evidence with a trembling finger. He saw it immediately, his face going several shades paler. "How long ago did you last put wood on that fire?" "Before dinner, maybe 6 hours. That print's fresh," he said. "Made while the ash was still soft from the heat. That means—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air between us like a poisonous cloud. Our stalker had been inside the cabin while we slept, standing right here in our sanctuary, watching us. The knocking at the door had been a diversion, drawing Grandpa Eugene's attention to the front of the building, while the intruder moved freely through our temporary home. "How did he get in?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Grandpa Eugene was already moving, checking windows and doors with methodical efficiency. At the back of the cabin, near the small kitchen area, he found what he was looking for: an open window, its screen carefully removed and set aside. The opening was just large enough for a determined person to squeeze through. "Professional," he muttered. Knew exactly what he was doing. Probably been watching this place for days, learning our routines. The word professional sent a new kind of fear through me. This wasn't some random crazy person or opportunistic criminal. This was someone with training, with skills, with a plan that we couldn't hope to understand or counter. "We need to go," I said urgently. "Right now." Grandpa Eugene grabbed his truck keys from the kitchen table and moved toward the front door. "Stay close to me," he instructed. "When I open this door, we move fast and direct to the truck. No hesitation, no looking around. Just get in and lock the doors." He positioned himself beside the door, pistol ready, flashlight beam focused on the latch mechanism. With his free hand, he slowly turned the deadbolt, the metallic click seeming to echo through the forest beyond. "Now," he whispered. We burst through the door like runners leaving starting blocks, crossing the front porch in 3 quick strides and leaping down into the clearing. The truck sat about 20 yards away, its familiar bulk a beacon of hope in the surrounding darkness. Halfway there, Grandpa Eugene's flashlight beam swept across something that made us both stumble. A trail of dark spots in the dirt, leading from the window where he'd fired his shot to the edge of the tree line. Blood. He had hit our stalker. But wounded animals were often more dangerous than healthy ones, and I had a terrible feeling that the same principle applied to wounded men. We reached the truck without incident, and I dove into the passenger seat while Grandpa Eugene slammed his door and immediately engaged the locks. The familiar smell of old leather and motor oil was overwhelmingly comforting after the sterile terror of the cabin. "Keys," he muttered, fumbling with the ignition. "Come on, start up." The engine turned over on the first try, and the headlights blazed to life, cutting through the darkness and illuminating the narrow dirt road that led back to civilization. Grandpa Eugene put the truck in drive and pressed the accelerator, gravel spraying behind us as we lurched forward. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe we were safe. The truck was solid, reliable, a steel cocoon that could carry us away from whatever madness had invaded our peaceful retreat. The speedometer needle climbed steadily as we gained momentum down the winding mountain road. Then the headlights caught something that made my heart stop. There, standing directly in the center of the road about 50 yards ahead, was our stalker. In the harsh glare of the headlights, I could see him clearly for the first time. He was tall and lean, probably in his 30s, with shoulder-length dark hair and a face that would have been unremarkable except for the eyes. Even at this distance, those eyes seemed to burn with an intensity that made me want to look away. He was indeed wounded. I could see dark stains on his left shoulder and arm where Grandpa Eugene's bullet had found its mark. But instead of fleeing or seeking medical attention, he had positioned himself squarely in our escape route, as if he'd known exactly where we would try to go. Most terrifying of all was what he held in his right hand, a large hunting knife, its blade catching the truck's headlights and throwing back cruel reflections. The weapon looked professional, military grade, designed for serious work. "What do we do?" I whispered, though speaking quietly seemed pointless when we were sitting behind several thousand pounds of steel and glass. Grandpa Eugene's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "He's betting I won't run him down," he said grimly. "Thinks I'm too civilized, too decent to commit vehicular homicide." "Are you?" The question hung in the air between us as our stalker began walking toward the truck. Not running, not charging, just walking with the patient confidence of someone who knew the outcome was inevitable. Each step brought him closer to our headlight beams, revealing more details I wished I couldn't see. His clothing was indeed all black, military-style cargo pants, a long-sleeved tactical shirt, and boots that looked like they could kick through a concrete wall. Everything was functional, purposeful, chosen by someone who understood violence and how to deliver it efficiently. But it was his expression that truly terrified me. There was no anger there, no rage or passion, just a kind of cold calculation, as if he were working through a complex mathematical problem and we were simply variables in his equation. "He's not afraid of us," I realized aloud. "Even with the gun, even with the truck, he's not afraid." "That's what worries me," Grandpa Eugene admitted. "Man who's not afraid is either crazy or very, very good at what he does." The stalker was now close enough that I could see individual details of his face. The sharp cheekbones, the thin lips, the way his eyes never seemed to blink. He raised his left hand, the one not holding the knife, and made a simple gesture. Palm up, fingers beckoning. "Come here." "Oh God," I breathed. "He wants us to get out of the truck." Grandpa Eugene put the transmission in reverse. Like hell. The truck began backing up, but we'd only gone a few yards when the engine began to sputter and cough. Within seconds, it died completely, leaving us sitting in darkness with only the pale moonlight filtering through the forest canopy. "What happened?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Grandpa Eugene turned the key repeatedly, but the engine wouldn't even turn over. "Sugar in the gas tank, maybe. Or sand. Something to kill the engine." His voice was tight with controlled fear. He's been planning this for a while. Our stalker had resumed his approach, no longer bothering to stay in the center of the road. Now he moved with purpose, angling toward the driver's side of the truck. In the faint moonlight, the blade of his knife seemed to glow with its own malevolent energy. "The gun," I said desperately. "Shoot him." Through the window? At night? What if I miss? Grandpa Eugene's military training was showing through his fear. He was thinking tactically, considering angles and consequences. And what if I don't? You want to be out here with a dead body and no way to contact the authorities? The stalker was now close enough to the truck that I could hear his boots crunching on the gravel. He moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in the darkness, as if he could see perfectly despite the minimal light. "The windows," I whispered. "Can he break them? These old trucks? Hell yes. Safety glass won't stop a determined man with the right tools." As if he'd heard us, the stalker stopped beside the driver's door and raised his knife, positioning the heavy pommel like a hammer. His eyes met Grandpa Eugene's through the glass, and I saw him mouth a single word. "Out." "Drive," I said urgently. "Even if the engine won't start, we can coast down the hill. Get enough momentum to..." My words were cut off by the sound of metal striking glass. The stalker had brought the knife's handle down against the window with calculated force, not enough to shatter it immediately, but sufficient to spiderweb the safety glass with cracks. He raised the knife again. "Hold on," Grandpa Eugene said grimly, releasing the brake. The truck began rolling backward down the mountain road, gravity pulling us away from our attacker. But instead of trying to follow, the stalker simply stood there watching us go, his expression unchanged. Even in the fading light, I could see what might have been the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Why isn't he chasing us?" I asked. "Because he knows something we don't," Grandpa Eugene replied, fighting to keep control of the heavy vehicle as it gained speed. Without power steering or power brakes, the truck was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. We'd rolled perhaps 100 yards when we found out what our stalker knew. The road ahead was blocked by a massive fallen tree, easily 4 feet in diameter, lying directly across our path. In the darkness, we hadn't seen it on our way up the mountain, but now it loomed like a wooden wall in our headlight beams. Grandpa Eugene stomped on the brake pedal, and the truck slewed sideways before coming to a stop mere feet from the fallen giant. The impact would have been devastating. "That didn't fall naturally," he said, studying the clean break where the tree had been severed from its stump. "Chainsaw work, recent too, you can still smell the sap." We were trapped, blocked ahead by the tree, blocked behind by a man with a knife who seemed to know our every move before we made it. The mountain road was barely wide enough for one vehicle, with steep drop-offs on one side and impenetrable forest on the other. There was nowhere to go. "The trees," I said suddenly. "We could get out and run into the forest, find somewhere to hide until morning." Grandpa Eugene shook his head. "That's his territory now. He's been out there for days, maybe weeks. Knows every trail, every hiding spot. We'd be running blind while he hunts us with home field advantage." Behind us, I could see a faint light bobbing through the darkness, a flashlight moving steadily in our direction. Our stalker was finally coming for us, taking his time because he knew we had nowhere to go. "The CB radio," Grandpa Eugene said suddenly, reaching under the dashboard. "I forgot about the CB. Maybe someone's monitoring Channel 9. He flicked on the radio, and static filled the cab. "Mayday, mayday," he spoke into the microphone. "This is Eugene Patterson at Cabin 7, mile marker 15 on Forest Service Road 247. We have an emergency situation. Armed intruder, vehicle disabled. Request immediate assistance." Nothing but static answered him. "Mayday, any station, any station. We have a life-threatening emergency at..." The radio went dead. Not just quiet, completely silent, as if someone had cut the power cord. Grandpa Eugene checked the connections, tried different channels, even tested the power supply. Nothing. "He's jammed it somehow," he said in disbelief. "Or maybe cut our antenna cable while we were in the cabin." The flashlight behind us was getting closer. I could now make out the silhouette of our stalker moving with unhurried confidence down the mountain road. He knew we were trapped, knew we had exhausted our options. Now he was simply taking his time, savoring our desperation. "What does he want?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "I don't think he wants anything," Grandpa Eugene replied quietly. "I think this is what he wants. The hunt, the fear, the feeling of being in complete control of other people's lives." The implications of that statement hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a robbery or a kidnapping or any crime with rational motives. This was something much worse. A predator who killed for the pure enjoyment of killing, who had chosen us as his prey simply because we'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. "We have to fight," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "Even if we can't win, we have to try." Grandpa Eugene looked at me with something that might have been pride mixed with profound sadness. "You're right, but we're going to be smart about it. This man is dangerous, but he's also wounded and working alone. If we can separate him from his advantages..." He began checking his weapons, the pistol, a folding knife from his pocket, even the heavy flashlight that could serve as a club. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. "When he gets close enough," Grandpa Eugene continued, "I'm going to get out of the truck and face him. While he's focused on me, you slip out the passenger side and run for the trees. Don't try to be a hero. Just run and keep running until you find help. I'm not leaving you alone with him. You're 13 years old, and this isn't a debate." His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Your job is to survive and get help. My job is to make sure you have that chance." The stalker was now close enough that we could hear his footsteps on the gravel road. He was in no hurry, taking time to examine the truck, perhaps planning his next move. The beam of his flashlight played across our rear window, and I caught a glimpse of that same cold smile. "Get ready," Grandpa Eugene whispered, his hand on the door handle. Grandpa Eugene stepped out of the truck with his pistol raised, his voice carrying the authority of his military training. "That's far enough," he called out. "I'm armed, and I will use this weapon to defend myself and my grandson." The stalker stopped about 20 feet away, his flashlight beam now pointed directly at Grandpa Eugene's face. In the harsh white light, my grandfather looked older than his 68 years, but his hands were steady and his stance was solid. "You shot me," the stalker said, and his voice was exactly what I'd expected, calm, cultured, completely without emotion. He might have been commenting on the weather. "Should have aimed better," Grandpa Eugene replied. "What do you want?" "Want?" The stalker seemed to consider the question seriously. "I want to see how this ends. I want to know if you'll really pull that trigger when it counts. I want to understand what you'll do when you realize that gun can't save you. Try me." Instead of advancing, the stalker began moving in a slow circle around the truck, forcing Grandpa Eugene to turn to keep him in sight. It was a smart tactic. It kept my grandfather moving, prevented him from establishing a solid shooting position, and gradually worked the stalker around to where he'd have access to both doors of the truck. "You know what's interesting about fear?" The stalker continued his casual conversation as he moved. "Most people think it's about the threat of death, but it's not. Death is actually quite peaceful. Fear is about the loss of control, the understanding that all your plans and preparations mean nothing when faced with someone who doesn't follow the rules." I watched this deadly dance through the truck's windows, my heart hammering so hard I was sure both men could hear it. The stalker was now moving past the front of the truck, bringing him closer to the passenger side where I sat frozen in terror. "The boy," the stalker said suddenly, his flashlight beam swinging toward my window. "He's been very quiet. Is he praying, crying, planning something heroic? Leave him out of this," Grandpa Eugene said sharply. "Oh, but he's the whole point," the stalker replied, now directly in front of the truck. "You see, killing adults is mundane. They've had time to accept their mortality, to make peace with death. But children still believe they're immortal. The terror in their eyes when they realize the truth is absolutely exquisite." That was when I understood with crystalline clarity that we were both going to die. This wasn't a robbery or a kidnapping or any crime with rational limits. This was a predator who had chosen us for entertainment. who would draw out our suffering for as long as possible before finally ending it. But understanding brought its own kind of strength. If death was inevitable, then I had nothing left to lose by fighting back. While the stalker was focused on his conversation with Grandpa Eugene, I quietly opened the passenger door and slipped out of the truck. The gravel crunched softly under my feet, but the sound was masked by the men's voices. Moving with more stealth than I'd known I possessed, I crept around the back of the truck toward the rear of our stalker. He was still talking, still playing his psychological games, completely unaware that his prey had begun stalking him. "The thing about fear," he was saying, "is that it makes people predictable. Right now, you're calculating distances, wondering if you can get a clear shot before I reach the boy. You're thinking like a soldier instead of thinking like a predator." I was now close enough to smell him, sweat, blood from his wound, and something else that reminded me of dead leaves. In his left hand he held the flashlight. In his right, that terrible knife. But he was focused entirely forward, on Grandpa Eugene and the truck. "What you don't understand," the stalker continued, "is that I've been planning this for weeks. I know this road, these trees, the exact distance from your cabin to the nearest help. I know that your CB radio won't work because I cut the antenna cable 3 days ago. I know that your truck won't start because I put sand in the gas tank while you were sleeping last night." 3 more steps. I could see the fresh blood on his shoulder where Grandpa Eugene's bullet had torn through fabric and flesh. Could see the way he favored that arm, keeping most of his weight on his right side. "What you really don't understand," the stalker said, raising his knife, "is that I've killed 12 people in the last 2 years and no one has ever—" I hit him from behind with every ounce of strength in my 13-year-old body, driving my shoulder into his wounded arm. He screamed, the first real emotion I'd heard from him, and the knife went flying into the darkness. "Now!" I shouted to Grandpa Eugene. The pistol crack was deafening in the mountain silence. The stalker jerked backward, clutching his chest, his flashlight spiraling away to smash against a tree trunk. For a moment, he stood swaying in the moonlight, his face expressing something that might have been surprise. Then he fell. Grandpa Eugene was beside me in seconds, his arms wrapping around me in a fierce embrace that smelled of gunpowder and fear sweat. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. "Did he touch you?" "I'm okay," I managed, though I was shaking so violently I could barely stand. Together, we stood over the body of our stalker. In death, he looked smaller, less threatening, just a man who had made the fatal mistake of underestimating his prey. The wound in his chest was directly over his heart. Grandpa Eugene's aim had been perfect. "We need to get out of here," he said after checking for a pulse. "Find a way around that tree, get to town, call the police." It took us 4 hours of hiking through rough terrain to reach the nearest ranger station. By then the sun was rising, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink that seemed impossible after the horrors of the night. The police investigation revealed that our stalker had indeed been responsible for multiple murders across 3 states, all of them families or individuals camping in remote areas. His truck, hidden 2 miles from our cabin, contained trophies from his victims, jewelry, photographs, personal items that told the story of lives cut short for no reason other than one man's twisted need for power. We never went back to the cabin. Grandpa Eugene sold it to the State Forestry Service, and they turned it into a ranger station. Sometimes I wonder if the new occupants ever sense the echoes of that terrible night, if they ever wake to the sound of footsteps on the front porch or catch glimpses of movement in the tree line. 3 years have passed, but I still start awake sometimes in the early hours of the morning, my heart racing with remembered terror. The doctors say the nightmares will fade with time, but some experiences carve themselves so deeply into memory that they become part of who you are. I learned that night that evil exists in the world, that there are people who kill for pleasure rather than profit or passion. But I also learned that ordinary people, a grandfather and his grandson, can find extraordinary courage when faced with the unthinkable. And sometimes, when the darkness seems overwhelming, I remember that we won. Against impossible odds, with nothing but determination and love for each other, we survived. We fought back. We made it home. That has to count for something. I spend most of my free time hiking through untamed wilderness, just me and the raw beauty of nature. There's something profoundly satisfying about being completely alone with the natural world, undisturbed, pure, authentic. When my wife Helen had to relocate for her new position at the regional medical center, she convinced me that our move would be perfect. A small cottage nestled on the outskirts of town, with direct access to thousands of acres of pristine forest just waiting to be explored. We never wanted children. Both of us were content with our 3 cats, Midnight, Whiskers, and Patches. They were our family, our responsibility, our joy. Moving with pets had always been a challenge, and I'm embarrassed to admit we'd left a trail of confused new homeowners across the country, each inheriting cats who simply refused to adapt to change. After nearly 4 weeks of unpacking and settling into our new place, I finally felt ready to tackle the wilderness that had been calling to me since we arrived. The morning of September 15th, 2023, I woke before dawn with an excitement I hadn't felt in months. Helen could see the anticipation radiating from me as I puttered around the kitchen, checking and rechecking my hiking gear. She watched with amusement as I organized my backpack for the 3rd time, testing the weight distribution and ensuring every essential item was accounted for. "Water?" she asked, running through our usual pre-hike checklist. "2 full bottles plus purification tablets," I confirmed. "Food?" "Energy bars, trail mix, and a sandwich for lunch." "First aid kit?" "Bandages, antiseptic, pain relievers, emergency whistle, everything's there." She nodded toward the locked cabinet in our bedroom. "What about protection?" I patted the holster on my left hip. The weight of the .38 revolver felt reassuring against my side. Helen had never been comfortable with firearms, and I understood her concerns completely. But hiking alone in unfamiliar territory demanded certain precautions. Wild animals, dangerous terrain, potential encounters with unsavory individuals. The wilderness held beauty and peril in equal measure. "Weather forecast still looking good?" she asked, wrapping her arms around my waist from behind. "Clear skies, mild temperatures, light winds, perfect conditions." I turned in her embrace and smiled. "Don't worry, Helen. This isn't my first adventure into the unknown." It was a small tradition between us, that reassuring phrase. Helen had never shared my passion for hiking. She despised sweating, couldn't tolerate insects, and found extended walking tedious. I considered myself fortunate that my primary vice involved fresh air and exercise rather than alcohol, gambling, or expensive hobbies. Deep down, I suspected she hoped I'd eventually find a hiking companion in our new town, someone to share these expeditions so she wouldn't feel obligated to join me. After kissing Helen goodbye as she prepared for another demanding day at the medical center, I loaded my gear into our sedan and began the 40-minute drive to Cascade Ridge National Forest. The journey took me through winding country roads, past farmhouses and rolling hills that gradually gave way to dense woodland. As I climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew cooler and crisper, carrying the rich scent of pine and earth. The parking area at the trailhead was nearly deserted when I arrived just after 8 a.m. A young family was setting up a picnic at one of the wooden tables near the restrooms, their 2 small children racing around the playground equipment with boundless energy. An elderly couple sat on a bench, sharing coffee from a thermos and pointing toward different mountain peaks visible in the distance. I methodically checked my gear one final time, adjusting straps and testing buckles. The visitor center sat adjacent to the parking area. a rustic log structure that blended seamlessly with the forest surroundings. A park ranger emerged from the building as I shouldered my pack, raising his hand in a friendly wave. "Beautiful morning for a hike," he called out, his weathered face creasing into a genuine smile. "Couldn't ask for better conditions," I agreed, approaching the information board mounted near the visitor center entrance. The display showed detailed trail maps with routes color-coded by difficulty level. Each trail listing included estimated hiking times, elevation changes, terrain descriptions, and notes about local wildlife. I photographed the entire board with my phone, zooming in to capture crucial details clearly. The ranger approached with a printed trail map, which I accepted gratefully. "First time visiting Cascade Ridge?" he inquired. "Just moved to the area. I've been eager to explore these mountains since we arrived." "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said warmly. "Sounds like you have some hiking experience." "I've been doing this for about 8 years now. Started with day hikes and gradually worked up to multi-day backcountry trips." "Good to hear. Just remember to stick to the marked trails. We've had a few incidents this season with folks wandering off path and getting themselves turned around. The terrain can be deceptive, especially for newcomers." "Absolutely. I'll stay on the designated routes." "Have a safe hike," he said as I headed toward the trailhead. I selected the most challenging available route, the Ridgeline Trail, marked in black on the difficulty chart. The description promised steep ascents, rocky terrain, and spectacular panoramic views from the summit. The estimated round-trip time was 7 hours, which suited my plans perfectly. The trail would take me to an elevation of nearly 4,800 feet, offering breathtaking vistas of the valley and surrounding mountain ranges. The initial portion of the Ridgeline Trail wound gently through old-growth forest, following a well-maintained path marked with distinctive blue blazes painted on tree trunks every 50 yards. Towering pines and firs created a natural cathedral above me, their branches filtering the morning sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. The forest floor was carpeted with decades of fallen needles, creating a soft, springy surface that absorbed the sound of my footsteps. For the first hour, I encountered several other hikers, a group of college students heading out for a weekend camping trip, an older gentleman with professional photography equipment, and a woman walking her energetic border collie. We exchanged friendly greetings and brief conversations about trail conditions and weather expectations. The social interactions felt reassuring, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in this vast wilderness. As I climbed higher and the trail grew steeper, the encounters with other people became less frequent. The well-groomed path gradually gave way to rougher terrain, with exposed roots and loose rocks requiring more careful foot placement. My breathing deepened as the elevation gain demanded greater effort, but I maintained a steady, sustainable pace. 3 hours into the hike, I reached the first major waypoint, a small clearing with several designated camping sites, each marked with a metal fire ring and a wooden picnic table. A basic vault toilet had been constructed at the edge of the clearing, and a hand-pumped well provided access to groundwater. The entire area was deserted, which wasn't entirely surprising for a weekday in late September. I took advantage of the facilities, refilled my water bottles, and consumed half of my sandwich while studying the trail map. According to my calculations, I was making excellent time. The most challenging section, a steep switchbacking climb to the ridgeline, lay ahead. From there, it would be a relatively easy traverse to the summit overlook. The surrounding forest was alive with natural sounds. Birds called from the canopy overhead, their songs echoing through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker hammered rhythmically against dead timber. Occasionally, I heard rustling in the underbrush as small animals moved through their territory, probably squirrels or chipmunks gathering food for the approaching winter. After a 20-minute rest, I shouldered my pack and continued upward. The trail became increasingly challenging, requiring the use of my hands for balance as I scrambled over rocky outcroppings and navigated around fallen trees. My heart rate elevated, and sweat began to soak through my hiking shirt despite the cool mountain air. Another hour of steady climbing brought me to a dramatic viewpoint where the forest opened up, revealing the valley spread out far below. I could make out the town where Helen was working, the geometric patterns of agricultural fields, and the ribbon of highway that had brought me to the mountains. I paused to capture several photographs, including a selfie that I immediately sent to Helen with the message, "Reached the viewpoint. The climb was worth every step." My phone showed full signal strength, and Helen's response came through within minutes. "Gorgeous view. Be careful up there. Love you." I typed back quickly, "Always careful. See you tonight for dinner." As I continued toward the summit, the trail became less distinct. The blue blazes appeared less frequently, sometimes separated by distances that required careful searching to locate the next marker. The forest grew denser, with thick underbrush crowding close to the narrow path. Several times I had to push through tangles of thorny shrubs that caught at my clothing and scratched exposed skin. The wildlife sounds that had provided constant background noise throughout the morning gradually faded away. The absence of birdsong struck me as unusual, creating an unnatural silence that made every sound I generated, footsteps, breathing, the rustle of my clothing, seem unnaturally loud and intrusive. During a moment of uncertainty about the trail direction, I noticed what appeared to be a shortcut, a narrow gap between two massive boulders that seemed to lead in the general direction I needed to travel. The official trail curved away to the left, adding what looked like an unnecessary detour around a steep hillside. Against my better judgment and the park ranger's explicit instructions to stay on marked paths, I decided to investigate the apparent shortcut. The gap between the boulders was just wide enough for me to squeeze through sideways, my backpack scraping against the rough granite surfaces. On the other side, I found myself in a small natural corridor formed by towering rock walls. The passage extended for perhaps 30 yards before opening into what appeared to be another section of forest. Just a quick look, I told myself. If it doesn't connect back to the main trail within a few minutes, I'll return to the marked path. The corridor led into a grove of trees unlike any I had encountered during the morning's hike. These were older, larger specimens with trunks so massive that 3 people holding hands couldn't encircle them. Their canopy was so dense that very little sunlight penetrated to ground level, creating an environment of perpetual twilight even though it was barely past noon. The temperature seemed to drop noticeably as I moved deeper into the grove. The air felt thick and humid, almost tropical, which made no sense given the mountain elevation and season. More disturbing was the complete absence of sound. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the branches overhead. The silence was so profound that it felt oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I checked my compass, a reliable backup navigation tool I always carried. The needle spun erratically, unable to find magnetic north. I tapped the instrument and tried again with the same result. Electronic devices could malfunction, but a simple magnetic compass shouldn't be affected by anything in a normal forest environment. Growing increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, I turned to retrace my steps back to the boulder passage. To my alarm, the narrow corridor I had just walked through was no longer visible. The grove appeared to extend in all directions, with no obvious exit point. Dense underbrush blocked most sight lines beyond a few dozen yards. Fighting down a surge of panic, I methodically began working my way around the perimeter of the grove, searching for the gap between the boulders. Every direction looked identical, towering trees, thick underbrush, and that unnatural twilight atmosphere. After 20 minutes of careful searching, I was forced to accept that I had somehow become disoriented in a way that defied logical explanation. I retrieved my phone to call for help, but the device showed no signal bars. More troubling, the GPS function couldn't acquire a satellite lock despite the fact that I was outdoors with a clear view of the sky through gaps in the canopy. The phone's compass app spun just as uselessly as my magnetic compass. Forcing myself to remain calm, I reviewed my options. The grove couldn't be infinitely large. If I picked a direction and walked in a straight line, I would eventually reach its edge and hopefully regain my bearings. I used my knife to mark trees as I passed them, carving small arrows to indicate my direction of travel and prevent walking in circles. For what felt like hours, I pushed through the dense forest, marking trees and maintaining what I believed to be a straight course. The light never changed, remaining at that dim twilight level regardless of what the actual time might be. My watch showed different times each time I checked it. First 2:30 p.m., then 11:15 a.m., then 6:45 p.m. The digital display seemed to be malfunctioning as badly as my other navigation equipment. Exhaustion was beginning to affect my judgment. My water supply was half depleted, and I had consumed most of my food during the extended hiking. More concerning was the psychological impact of being lost in such an abnormal environment. The persistent silence was wearing on my nerves, making me jump at every small sound I created. As afternoon wore on, or what I assumed was afternoon based on my deteriorating sense of time, I began to notice changes in my surroundings that couldn't be explained by fatigue or stress. Trees that I was certain I had marked with my knife appeared unmarked when I encountered them again. Paths that had been blocked by fallen logs or dense brush seemed to open up when I approached from different directions. Just as true desperation was beginning to set in, I stumbled into a large clearing that contained a sight both welcome and deeply unsettling. A log cabin surrounded by a tall chain-link fence topped with coils of razor wire. The structure appeared to be well maintained, with smoke rising from a stone chimney and warm light glowing through curtained windows. A generator hummed quietly somewhere behind the building, explaining the electric lights I could see. The fencing formed a perfect square approximately 100 yards on each side, with the cabin positioned in the center of the enclosed area. At each corner of the fence perimeter stood tall posts supporting powerful floodlights, currently switched off but obviously designed to illuminate the entire compound after dark. Multiple warning signs were attached to the fence at regular intervals. I approached close enough to read the signs. Most were official-looking metal placards: no trespassing, private property, authorized personnel only, and warning, electrified fence. But scattered among these official warnings were handmade signs that were far more disturbing. Pieces of cardboard and cloth bore messages scrawled in what looked like brown paint or dried blood. Turn back now. They don't want you here. And most ominously, simply don't. The temperature had been dropping steadily since I entered the strange grove, and now I was genuinely cold. My breath was beginning to form visible clouds in the increasingly frigid air, despite the fact that it had been a warm September morning when I started hiking. Looking up at the sky through the clearing, I could see heavy gray clouds gathering overhead, and the first few snowflakes were beginning to fall. Snow in September at this elevation wasn't impossible, but the rapid weather change was extremely unusual. I had checked the extended forecast carefully before leaving home, and no precipitation had been predicted for at least a week. Yet here I was, watching snowfall steadily increase in intensity. My phone still showed no signal, but I could see that I had several unread messages from Helen. The timestamps made no sense. Some appeared to be from hours in the future, others from dates that hadn't occurred yet. One message from Helen was particularly confusing. "Where are you? You were supposed to be home 2 hours ago. I'm starting to worry." According to my planned schedule, I shouldn't even be starting my descent for another 2 hours. Either my watch was malfunctioning badly, or something very strange was happening with time itself in this place. The snowfall was becoming heavy enough to create a genuine survival situation. My hiking clothes were suitable for cool weather, but not for a snowstorm. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I could feel the early stages of hypothermia beginning to affect my thinking and coordination. Despite the ominous warning signs, the cabin represented the only available shelter in a potentially life-threatening situation. I had to make a choice between following the posted warnings and risking death from exposure. The decision wasn't really a choice at all. I found what appeared to be the main gate in the fence, a heavy metal door secured with multiple locks and deadbolts. To my surprise, the gate was slightly ajar, as if someone had recently passed through without properly securing it behind them. The gap was just wide enough for me to squeeze through sideways. The moment I stepped inside the fenced perimeter, several things became immediately apparent. First, the snow wasn't accumulating within the compound as heavily as it was outside the fence. Second, the air was noticeably warmer, creating an artificial microclimate around the cabin. Third, and most disturbing, I could see fresh footprints in the light snow. Human footprints that led from the gate directly to the cabin's front door. Someone else was here, or had been here very recently. The cabin's front door stood slightly open, revealing a warm, inviting interior lit by kerosene lamps and the glow from a stone fireplace. The sound of wood crackling in the fire was clearly audible, and I could smell the distinctive scent of burning pine. After hours in the cold, silent forest, these normal domestic sounds and smells were incredibly appealing. "Hello?" I called out, loudly enough to be heard inside the cabin. "Is anyone there? I'm a hiker who got lost in the storm. I need shelter." No response came from within the building. I called out again, explaining my situation in more detail, but received only silence in return. The footprints I had observed led directly to the front door, but there were no corresponding tracks leading away from the cabin. Whoever had made those prints was presumably still inside. The snowstorm was intensifying rapidly, and the temperature continued to plummet. Ice crystals were beginning to form on my eyelashes and facial hair. My fingers were becoming numb despite my insulated gloves, and I could feel the early warning signs of frostbite in my toes. Staying outside much longer would result in serious cold weather injuries or death. I approached the cabin cautiously, my right hand resting on the grip of my holstered revolver. The weapon felt awkward in that position. I was left-handed and normally carried it on my left hip for a natural cross-draw. Somehow, I had apparently moved it to my right side without remembering doing so, probably during one of my many gear adjustments while lost in the forest. "I'm coming in," I announced loudly. "I don't mean any harm. I just need to get out of this weather." I pushed the door open slowly and stepped across the threshold into warmth and light. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly spacious and well-appointed. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a robust fire burning brightly. Comfortable furniture was arranged around the room: a leather couch, several wooden chairs, and a dining table set for 2 people. Kerosene lamps provided adequate lighting, and I could hear the steady hum of a generator somewhere outside. What immediately struck me as odd was how pristine everything appeared. The dining table was set with clean plates, glasses, and silverware, as if someone was expecting guests for dinner. 2 coffee cups sat on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, still steaming as if they had just been filled. A kettle whistled softly on a wood-burning stove in the corner. Yet there was absolutely no sign of human occupancy. No coats hanging by the door, no personal items visible anywhere, no indication that anyone actually lived in this place. It felt more like a movie set or a museum display than a real home. I called out again, more insistently this time. "I know someone is here. I saw your footprints in the snow. I'm not looking for trouble, I just need shelter until this storm passes." The only response was the continued crackling of the fire and the soft whistle of the kettle. I moved further into the room, examining my surroundings more carefully. The cabin was constructed of solid log walls with thick wooden beams supporting the ceiling. Heavy curtains covered the windows, blocking any view of the outside. A hallway led toward what appeared to be a bedroom and bathroom in the back of the structure. On the dining table, partially hidden under some papers, I noticed a large-scale topographic map of the local area. Red X marks had been drawn at various locations throughout the forest, connected by lines in what appeared to be some kind of pattern or route. My hiking trail was clearly marked, along with several other popular routes used by recreational hikers. More disturbing were the notes written in the margins of the map. In neat handwriting, someone had documented dates, times, and what appeared to be descriptions of hikers. Male, 30s, red backpack, hiking alone, 912. Female, blonde hair, with dog, 98, and dozens of similar entries going back several months. At the bottom of the map, in different handwriting that looked more hurried and desperate, someone had written, "They watch from the trees. Stay inside after dark. Don't trust the voices. The fence won't keep them out forever." I spent several minutes studying the map and its disturbing annotations, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The systematic recording of hiker information suggested some kind of surveillance operation, but for what purpose? The panicked notes about watching eyes and voices implied something far more sinister than simple observation. My examination of the evidence was interrupted by a sound from outside, a low, rhythmic thumping like someone striking the side of a building with a heavy object. The sound came from the rear of the cabin, near where I had heard the generator running. I moved to the back window and carefully pulled aside the curtain to peer outside. The view through the window revealed the back portion of the fenced compound. In the failing light and swirling snow, I could make out several dark shapes moving along the fence line. At first, I assumed they were deer or other wildlife seeking shelter from the storm, but as I watched more carefully, their movement patterns were wrong for animals. They moved in perfect coordination, maintaining equal spacing between each figure, and their shapes were too upright, too human-like. The thumping sound continued, steady and deliberate. It wasn't random banging. It had the rhythm of a signal, like someone tapping out a code. As I watched, one of the figures near the fence raised what appeared to be a long stick or pole and struck the chain-link barrier. The metallic clang carried clearly through the storm, and I realized I had found the source of the rhythmic thumping. My blood pressure spiked as the implications of what I was seeing began to register. These weren't lost hikers seeking shelter. The coordinated movement, the deliberate signaling, the patient positioning around the compound, this was organized, purposeful behavior. I was not alone in this remote location, and whoever was outside had me surrounded. I let the curtain fall back into place and quickly moved away from the window. My mind raced through possible explanations and courses of action. The most rational part of my brain insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps researchers conducting some kind of wildlife study, or park rangers investigating reports of illegal activities in the forest. But the evidence didn't support benign explanations. The disturbing map annotations, the abandoned feeling cabin with its too perfect domestic setup, the systematic surveillance of hikers, and now the coordinated presence of multiple figures outside the fence. Everything pointed toward something far more threatening. I checked my phone again, hoping the electronic interference that had been blocking signals might have cleared. Still no service, and the device was displaying increasingly erratic behavior. The time jumped between different readings as I watched, and the battery indicator fluctuated wildly, despite being fully charged when I left home. The thumping outside ceased abruptly, leaving only the sound of wind and the crackling fire. In the sudden quiet, I became aware of another sound. Soft footsteps moving around the exterior of the cabin. Not the heavy boots of hikers or workers, but something lighter, more stealthy. The footsteps circled the building slowly, pausing occasionally as if the walker was examining windows or doors. I drew my revolver and checked the cylinder. 6 rounds loaded with a speed loader in my pocket containing 6 more. 12 bullets against an unknown number of potential threats. The odds weren't encouraging, but at least I wasn't completely defenseless. The footsteps stopped directly outside the front door. I could hear breathing. Slow, deliberate, controlled breathing like someone trying to remain perfectly quiet. The door handle began to turn with agonizing slowness, the metal mechanism creating barely audible clicks as it rotated. I took position behind the dining table, using it as cover while keeping my weapon trained on the entrance. My hands were steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system, Years of target practice and hunter safety training had ingrained proper firearm handling into muscle memory. The door opened just a few inches, and I could see a shadow in the gap. "I'm armed," I announced clearly. "If you come through that door uninvited, I will defend myself." The shadow froze for several seconds, then the door slowly closed again. The breathing sound faded as whoever was outside moved away from the entrance. But I could still hear the soft footsteps circling the building, now joined by additional sets of footsteps. More figures had arrived, or others who had been watching silently had begun to move. Over the next hour, as darkness fell completely and the snowstorm continued to rage, the activity outside the cabin intensified dramatically. The soft footsteps had been joined by other sounds, voices whispering in the distance, the occasional metallic clang of someone testing the fence, and what sounded like equipment being moved or positioned around the compound. I had barricaded the front door using the dining table and one of the wooden chairs. The back door leading from the kitchen was secured with a heavy wooden beam that appeared to have been installed specifically for that purpose. All the curtains were drawn tight, preventing anyone outside from seeing in while also blocking my view of their activities. The kerosene lamps provided adequate light for moving around inside the cabin, but I kept them turned down low to avoid creating obvious shadows that might reveal my position to watchers outside. The fire in the fireplace had burned down to glowing coals, and I didn't dare add more wood for fear that the increased light might be visible through gaps in the curtains. My phone had finally stopped working entirely. The screen remained black no matter what buttons I pressed, and the device wouldn't respond to any attempts to restart it. My watch had also ceased functioning, leaving me with no way to track the passage of time except by observing the gradual dimming of the fire. As I explored the cabin more thoroughly, searching for additional weapons or tools that might be useful, I made several disturbing discoveries. In the bedroom, I found a journal hidden beneath the mattress. The entries, written in the same neat handwriting as the map annotations, documented months of observations. Day 47, 3 more hikers today. The watchers are becoming bolder, approaching the fence line during daylight hours. Changed the warning signs again, but people keep ignoring them. Day 52. Found evidence of a camp about 2 miles north. Looked like someone had been there for several days before leaving suddenly. All their gear was abandoned, including a backpack with identification. Reported it to authorities, but they didn't seem concerned. Day 58. The pattern is becoming clear. They're drawn to isolated hikers, especially those who wander off the marked trails. The fence provides some protection, but not permanently. I need to find a way to get word to the outside world. Day 63. Last entry. They're testing the fence systematically now, looking for weak points. The generator is running low on fuel, and I won't be able to make another supply run. If someone finds this journal, know that the forest itself has been compromised. Don't trust your equipment, don't trust your senses, and whatever you do, don't go into the trees alone after dark. The journal entries painted a picture of someone who had been living in the cabin for an extended period, studying the same phenomena that had trapped me. The references to watchers and they were ominously vague, but the fear and desperation in the later entries were unmistakable. In the kitchen, I found a radio, an old-fashioned analog unit that didn't rely on digital technology. When I turned it on, static filled the air, but by carefully adjusting the tuner, I was able to pick up fragments of broadcasts. Most were routine communications between park rangers, dispatchers, and emergency services, but one transmission made my heart race. Search and rescue operation initiated for missing hiker. Vehicle located at Cascade Ridge Trailhead. Family reports he failed to return as scheduled. Expanding search to include off-trail areas. They were looking for me. Helen had reported me missing when I failed to come home as planned. But how long had I been gone? The journal's final entry was dated 3 days ago, but that couldn't be right. I had only been hiking for 1 day. The radio crackled with another transmission. Day 3 of search operation. No trace of the missing hiker. Weather conditions hampering search efforts, requesting additional personnel and equipment. Day 3. That was impossible. I had left home this morning, hiked for several hours, become lost in the strange grove, and found the cabin. Even accounting for disorientation and the confusing time displays on my malfunctioning devices, I couldn't have been missing for 3 days. But the evidence was mounting that something was seriously wrong with my perception of time and reality. The journal entries, the radio broadcasts, the systematic surveillance documented in the map annotations, everything suggested that this location existed outside the normal flow of time and natural law. Throughout the endless night, the sounds outside the cabin continued. Sometimes the activity seemed to intensify, with multiple voices whispering in the darkness and the steady rhythm of footsteps circling the building. Other times, everything fell silent for long periods, creating an oppressive quiet that was somehow more frightening than the obvious presence of watchers. I dozed fitfully in one of the wooden chairs, my revolver across my lap and my senses alert for any change in the situation. Every small sound, the settling of the logs in the fireplace, wind rattling a loose shutter, the distant hum of the generator, brought me instantly to full alertness. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through gaps in the curtains, the activity outside gradually diminished. The voices fell silent, the footsteps faded away, and an almost normal quiet settled over the compound. I waited another hour before carefully approaching one of the front windows and peering outside. The snow had stopped falling, and the storm clouds were breaking up to reveal patches of blue sky. The compound looked completely normal in the morning light. No footprints in the snow, no evidence of the night's activities, no sign that anyone had been present except for my own tracks leading from the gate to the cabin door. My phone suddenly chirped back to life, the screen illuminating to show dozens of missed calls and text messages from Helen, my family, and numbers I didn't recognize. According to the timestamp, it was 7:30 a.m. on September 19th, 4 days after I had left home for what was supposed to be a single-day hike. The messages told a story of escalating concern and frantic searching. Helen's early messages were routine check-ins, but they quickly escalated to worried inquiries, then desperate pleas for me to call home. The later messages were from search and rescue coordinators, asking for any information about my planned route and current location. I tried calling Helen, but the call went straight to voicemail. Her recorded voice, familiar and comforting after the terrifying night, brought tears to my eyes. "Helen, it's me," I said after the beep. "I'm okay. I got lost in the storm and found shelter. I'm going to try to make my way back to the trailhead now. I love you." Before leaving the cabin, I took several photographs of the interior, the journal, the map with its disturbing annotations, the radio, and the general layout of the rooms. If I was going to report this incident to authorities, I would need evidence to support what would inevitably sound like an incredible story. The gate in the fence opened easily from the inside, and I stepped out into the crisp morning air. The moment I crossed the threshold of the compound, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as if I had passed from one reality into another. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on me throughout the night lifted, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could think clearly. I followed my own tracks back through the snow toward the grove of ancient trees where my ordeal had begun. But as I approached the area where I expected to find the grove, I discovered only normal forest, pine and fir trees of ordinary size, with typical mountain vegetation and clear sightlines in all directions. There was no sign of the massive trees that had trapped me, no evidence of the twilight grove where my compass had failed, and my sense of direction had been compromised. The landscape looked exactly as it should have based on the topographic maps I had studied before beginning my hike. Even more confusing, I found myself standing on the marked ridgeline trail, exactly where I should have been according to my original hiking plan. The blue blazes were clearly visible on the surrounding trees, and the trail surface showed the boot prints of other hikers who had passed this way recently. I followed the trail downhill, moving as quickly as my tired legs would carry me. The normal sounds of the forest, birdsong, rustling underbrush, wind in the trees, provided a comforting background as I descended toward the trailhead. Everything was exactly as it should be in a normal wilderness environment. 2 hours later, I emerged from the forest to find the parking area bustling with activity. Search and rescue vehicles, park service trucks, and several news vans filled the lot. A command post had been established near the visitor center, with maps, communication equipment, and volunteers coordinating search efforts. The moment I appeared at the tree line, still wearing my hiking gear and obviously exhausted but unharmed, a shout went up from the searchers. Within minutes, I was surrounded by paramedics, park rangers, police officers, and reporters, all asking questions and demanding explanations. Helen arrived within an hour, having been notified immediately when I was found. Her relief was overwhelming. She held me tightly while tears streamed down her face, alternately expressing her joy at my safe return and her anger at the worry I had caused. The official debriefing was extensive but ultimately unsatisfying for everyone involved. I told the truth about becoming disoriented in an unusual grove of trees, finding shelter in a cabin during an unexpected snowstorm, and making my way back to the trail when weather conditions improved. But I couldn't explain the 4-day time discrepancy, the electronic equipment malfunctions, or the disturbing evidence I had discovered in the cabin. When search teams were dispatched to locate the cabin based on my description and photographs, they found nothing. The coordinates I provided led to empty forest with no structures, no fence, and no evidence that any buildings had ever existed in that location. My photographs, which had been clear and detailed when I took them, showed only blurry, indistinct images that could have been taken anywhere. The GPS coordinates recorded by my phone placed me at locations that made no geographic sense, sometimes showing me in multiple places simultaneously. The medical examination found me to be in remarkably good condition for someone who had supposedly been lost in the wilderness for 4 days. I showed no signs of dehydration, malnutrition, or exposure injuries. My clothing was clean and undamaged, and I appeared well rested despite claiming to have spent several sleepless nights in survival conditions. Ultimately, the official report classified my disappearance as a case of hiking disorientation complicated by equipment failure and stress-induced time perception distortion. The investigators concluded that I had likely taken shelter in an existing structure, perhaps a hunting cabin or maintenance building, and that my memories of the events had been distorted by fatigue and psychological stress. But I know what I experienced was real. The journal entries, the systematic surveillance, the watchers in the darkness, all of it happened exactly as I remember. Somewhere in the mountains above our peaceful town, there exists a place where the normal rules of reality don't apply, where time moves differently, and where something ancient and malevolent watches the trails, waiting for isolated hikers to stray from the marked paths. I haven't returned to the forest since that day. Helen and I still live in the same house, but I've taken up different hobbies, gardening, woodworking, activities that keep me close to home and away from the wilderness. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling through the mountains, I think I can hear them calling to me, inviting me back to complete whatever dark purpose they had in mind. The forest still holds its secrets, and I pray that no other hiker will be curious enough to discover what lies hidden in the spaces between the marked trails. Some places are meant to remain unexplored, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. But on quiet evenings when Helen is working late at the medical center, I sometimes find myself standing at our back door, looking up at the dark tree line visible in the distance, wondering who might be up there right now, watching and waiting for the next lost soul to wander off the beaten path and into their carefully constructed web of confusion and terror. The mountains are beautiful during the day, peaceful and inviting, but they transform after dark into something entirely different, something that defies explanation and challenges everything we think we know about the natural world. I survived my encounter with that darkness, but I carry its memory with me every day. a constant reminder that reality is far more fragile and mysterious than most people ever realize. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if I really escaped at all, or if I'm still trapped in that cabin, living in a carefully constructed illusion, while something inhuman studies my reactions and plans its next move in a game whose rules I'll never understand.